Welcome to White Paper Podcasts, where our hosts Heather and Andre discuss a wide variety of informational sources, making them easy to understand through an informative and entertaining format. In today's podcast, Andre and Heather discuss the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and the role FEMA plays after the disaster. This podcast lasts approximately 10 minutes.
Seems like you've really been digging into this Hurricane Helene situation. You brought us news clips, even a first-hand account from a former FEMA worker. So are you trying to go beyond the headlines with this one?
Absolutely. This isn't just about a hurricane. It's about how these events become these huge flashpoints. Disaster preparedness, government response, how politicized it all gets. It's fascinating, really.
And Helene, it's not just a political football. The human cost is impossible to ignore. Especially when you see these news clips. The YouTube transcripts are really stark. Over 200 dead, did you say?
Over 200 confirmed, yeah, which makes Helene the deadliest hurricane since Katrina, and hundreds still unaccounted for.
It's easy to forget how quickly a natural disaster becomes a fight for survival.
Especially in those hardest hit areas. The images coming out of North Carolina and South Carolina, entire communities cut off. There was that one clip really got to me. A man stranded in the mountains trying to signal a helicopter with a mirror.
A week after the storm.
A full week later, and he's still completely isolated. It really makes you think about the relief effort. How effective is it really? And then you add in the political friction.
Like throwing fuel on a fire.
Exactly.
You've got Trump on one side saying the Biden administration is intentionally messing up aid distribution, even linking the hurricane to immigration policies.
And the White House pushing back hard, calling Trump's claims baseless, emphasizing that the disaster relief fund that's the main source of money FEMA uses for hurricane relief is totally separate from other funds, even those used by Homeland Security.
So we need to separate fact from fiction here. Like, what exactly is the Disaster Relief Fund, and how does it actually work?
Good question. This is where that firsthand account from the former FEMA worker you found is so helpful. He really helps break down the process, demystify it a little. So, Disaster Relief Fund, it's essentially a dedicated source of funding that FEMA can use after a federally declared disaster. This money is for things like debris removal, emergency shelter, individual assistance if you've lost a home or business.
And this is where that distinction between federal and state responsibilities comes in, right? Mm-hmm. The former FEMA worker kept stressing that. It's not like FEMA just shows up and takes over.
Exactly. He was very clear about that. FEMA is there to supplement, not replace, what state and local agencies are already doing. Those local responders, they're the first line of defense. What they do in those initial hours and days, it's crucial. FEMA is about providing support, additional resources once things have stabilized a bit.
He had some real eye-openers about the system, like even getting that disaster declaration, the thing that unlocks the federal aid, that can be a battle in itself.
Oh, absolutely. He mentioned one instance where a governor had to call the White House chief of staff directly just to get the disaster declaration expanded to include more counties. Apparently, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. Political maneuvering back and forth. It all has real consequences for how quickly people get the aid they need.
So you've got that image of that man in the mountains still waiting a week later. And now we're hearing about these bureaucratic hurdles, the politics. It makes you wonder.
How much of the delay is about logistics and how much is politics? Optics. It's a question that comes up every time, and it's something we'll definitely be exploring more as we dig deeper into the Hurricane Helene response. It's a crucial question, especially with a storm like Helene. The logistics must be a nightmare. And this is where your former FEMA worker, his perspective is so valuable. He's seen it firsthand, not just talking policy, but realities on the ground.
And he had some interesting stories about resource allocation. That's always a huge point of contention after a disaster.
Oh, for sure. He kept saying a presidential disaster declaration, it's essential, but it's not like unlimited funds magically appear. He talked about this whole other layer of assessments, approvals, and honestly, tough decisions about where the money goes first.
So how does that work? Is it just up to FEMA to decide which communities get what?
It's way more complicated than that. He described it as this back and forth, like a dance almost. Federal agencies, state governments, local communities, all vying for limited resources, right? And the criteria for who gets what, it's influenced by all sorts of things. Scale of the damage, of course, but also, and it's unfortunate, but political considerations play a role too.
He had that one example, something about generators in a hospital, right?
Yeah, he talked about this rural hospital, desperately needed generators after hurricane. They were top of the list for their state, but then FEMA had to divert some to a different state that got hit by a tornado. Those decisions, he said, they're never easy. It's about which community's needs are most urgent in that moment.
And on top of all that, you've got the recovery process, which, as he pointed out, can drag on for years, decades even.
That's what he kept stressing. The cameras leave, but it's not over. He made a comparison to the Texas freeze back in 2021. Everyone remembers those images, right? Burst pipes, people freezing in their homes. But even 2 years later, families were still struggling to rebuild. FEMA was still heavily involved.
It's not just about that initial response then. It's about having the resources and the commitment to see these communities through the long haul.
Exactly. He used this phrase, I thought it was really powerful, disaster fatigue. And he said it's not just individuals who experience it, it's the whole system. One disaster bleeds into the next. FEMA's resources are stretched thinner and thinner. It gets harder to maintain that same level of urgency and attention over time.
Which brings us back to Hurricane Helene and this current political firestorm. Because, yeah, the focus is on the immediate response, but we also need to think about the long term for these communities.
Yeah.
And this is where those accusations about how the Biden administration is handling aid, it gets even more charged.
Absolutely. When you have someone like Senator Lindsey Graham saying FEMA is being drained to fund migrant support instead of hurricane relief, it feeds into this fear that there won't be enough to go around.
And what's the truth there? Is there a link between FEMA's hurricane relief funding and the money being used at the border?
Here's where we have to be really careful about different pots of money. The disaster relief fund that we talked about, that's specifically for disaster response. It's separate from the funds that go to the Department of Homeland Security, which handles border security, immigration.
So Senator Graham is being misleading by linking those two things directly.
He is. However, and this is important, his comment does bring up a valid point about resource allocation in general. Even though the disaster relief fund is separate, anytime the government allocates funds, it's making choices, right?
So it's not like a direct pipeline from FEMA to the border, but there is a bigger conversation to be had about how these decisions are made, whether the government is funding disaster preparedness and response enough, especially with these increasingly frequent and severe weather events.
Exactly. And that's a conversation that goes beyond just partisan politics, you know? It's about making sure we're prepared as a nation to deal with the impacts of climate change on these communities.
And speaking of the bigger picture, we've got this disaster playing out against the backdrop of a very contentious election. Even the former FEMA worker mentioned how the storm's impact on North Carolina could affect the presidential race.
Right. Interesting.
But we should probably dig into that a bit more after we take a quick break.
Yeah.
And you're right, the election, even as we're talking about people rebuilding their lives, Hurricane Helene is already this talking point in the race. And then you see those images, Biden and Harris touring the damage. What do you make of that?
It's interesting, isn't it, how those images, they become so politically charged. You have people saying it's so important for leaders to show up, to be there, show empathy, you know, reassure people they're not forgotten. There's something to be said for that. Seeing the president there, it can boost morale.
Yeah, but there's another side to that too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Critics say these visits, yeah, maybe they're well-intentioned, but they can actually be disruptive. You've got this massive security operation that comes with a presidential visit, plus all the logistics of coordinating everything in a disaster zone.
So how do you weigh that visual reassurance versus the potential for things to get slowed down at such a critical time?
Well, and that's where perception becomes so powerful. Those images, the president consoling people, surveying the damage, they're everywhere. They shape how people see things, whether they reflect the reality on the ground or not.
It's like this PR game playing out against a real tragedy.
Yeah. It's complicated.
And it makes you think about what the former FEMA worker was saying about all the disasters we've seen lately, wildfires in California, that tornado outbreak. It feels like it's just one thing after another, like the nation is getting hit constantly.
And FEMA can only do so much. That disaster fatigue he talked about, it's real. The system, it's like it was designed for a different time when these things didn't happen so often or with such intensity.
So yeah, we're dealing with Helene right now, but there's this bigger question about the future. How do we prepare for this new reality? Changing climate, more extreme weather.
Exactly. We can't just react every time. We have to invest in mitigation, build things stronger, rethink how we prepare.
It's a lot, and it's easy to get overwhelmed by it all. I feel like this deep dive has really shown just how complex these situations are. Not just about the storm itself, but everything else it touches. Politics, people's lives.
It is. It's more than just headlines. And I think if there's one thing I hope people take away from this, it's to stay informed, to look deeper. These are critical issues, and we need to be talking about them honestly and thoughtfully.
Well said. It's like a reminder that even with all the devastation, there's still hope, and we can do something about it.
Absolutely.
So keep asking those tough questions, keep learning.
Couldn't agree more.
And on that note, we'll leave it there for today. We hope you found this deep dive insightful. Until next time, stay curious.